Okay, here we are again. Welcome to all. Uh, Welcome to Foreign Policy Week here in Political Science 110. And while we do have one more week to go after this one, this is my last recorded lecture, which is good for you and me both. But here we are, talking about U.S. foreign policy. This is more my area of expertise, so I'm always I don't know, happy to get to this week, not only because class is about over, but also, again, because this is more my area of expertise. But I really, if I had my choice, I'd spend a lot more time talking about foreign policy throughout the semester, but my hands are kind of tied and there's a lot to talk about. But anyway, the chapter opens, the 16th edition at least, with the discussion of Trump's foreign policy and Iran. However, given the new edition of the text and the road ahead in the Biden administration, and the fact that Afghanistan has been on our radar, or should have been on your radar, for pretty much the entirety of your lives, most of you, the U.S. in mid-2021, or by September 11th, 2021, according to Biden, is to be completely out of Afghanistan. And it looks like that by mid-July of 2021, this is indeed the case. This is a cover of The Economist magazine, one of my favorite magazines and news sources, marking the event. And I say should be on your radar because the U.S. went into Afghanistan after September 11th. I believe it was on October 7th, 6th or 7th of 2001. That the U.S. military, at least, opened fire there, and I'm sure the CIA was there prior, immediately after September 11th. But anyway, it's an interesting turning point in U.S. foreign policy history, and I'm sure the subsequent edition of the textbook will talk more about Afghanistan, or will probably open with Afghanistan in the next edition. But anyway, there we are, right? The United States went in there because the Taliban, which governed, if that's the right word, ruled Afghanistan at the time of the September 11th attacks, had given sanctuary to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And this is kind of the point of the Why We Fight film that you'll watch for next week. That has to do with the United States foreign policy and in particular the military-industrial complex. And we lose sight of Afghanistan, right? I mean, the war in Iraq got all the attention by 2003. But as Why We Fight points out, and contrary to popular opinion among most everybody in the United States, Iraq had nothing to do with September 11th. This is not a controversial statement. This is not an anti-Republican statement or anything of the sort. It's a fact. And then President George W. Bush will remind you of that in the film Why We Fight. But anyway, 2021 marked an important year in U.S. foreign policy, and I thought it was worth saying a few words about that to start the class for the week on foreign policy. But anyway, let's zoom out, give you a little history, then we'll take you back to where we're at now. What is foreign policy? Well, as you can read here, programs and policies that determine the U.S.'s relations with other states or countries and foreign entities. The chief actors of U.S. foreign policy are the president, the bureaucracy, and the Congress. However, the founders probably envisioned this to be inverted, this list at least, or at least with Congress at the top, and I'll explain why that is in a bit. But U.S. foreign policy is often intertwined with economic and social policy. And I'll try to remember to come back to something about this with Afghanistan in a sec. We think of foreign policy often as nonpartisan, and I have a sarcastic there after that. There was a senator from Michigan, I believe, Arthur Vandenberg, who in the mid-20th century, around the time of World War II or the start of the Cold War, famously said that politics ends at the country's shores or something to that effect, meaning that we should not politicize foreign policy, but that really by the start of the 21st century went out the window. Foreign policy, I think, is just as politicized as just about any other domestic policy we can think of, which makes it hard to make effective decisions, I think. That's my take. It's, Take that for what it's worth. Before I keep going here, I want to make a quick note on state and non-state actors here. You see occasionally in the text the term nation state, nation-state, which refers to countries, but really the two words nation and state should be used separately because they mean different things, right? If we're talking about people forming a political entity consisting of a group with common cultural experiences and identities, that's a nation. This is where we get the word nativity, right? A nativity scene is the scene of Jesus's birth, right? A prenatal care is care you receive before giving birth, right? If you know Spanish, right? Nacer means to be born. And that's the root of the word in English, nation, right? It comes from Latin. It's the same thing. This is different from a group of people who share a common political authority or political identity, which we call a state or a country, which are recognized by other sovereign states, right? So most countries are not true nation states. They're really very few. One, if we were in class, and I think I've said this a couple times before on the recorded lectures, if you ever need to guess anything about international politics, guess North Korea. So if I were to ask you, name me a true nation state, North Korea would be an excellent guess, right? The fact of the matter is most large countries have ethnically diverse populations, and pretty much every democracy receives migrants. Japan is a democracy. Japan has a very small indigenous population, the Ainu people in the north of the country, but it's like 99+% Japanese, ethnically Japanese. Japan, you could make a case. The population of Israel is overwhelmingly Jewish, but it's also about 20% Arab, Muslim, Palestinian, right? So there you go, right? And since Palestine isn't a state that's recognized by all other sovereign states, we can talk of the Palestinian people as a nation, but not as a state, right? So the United States would definitely not be a nation state because the United States is made up of people from literally all over the world this day and age. The evolution of how we got to where we are is not a pretty one and not a fair one. We know this. But from its very founding, the United States was never a nation state, right? It was never a completely, white, ethnically European state. And to delve a little deeper into that, Europe is 500 years ago, full of mostly white people, but it doesn't mean that they shared the same identity, right? Germany didn't become Germany until the 1800s. Same with Italy. And before then, you had a bunch of warring people who were fighting over what we would think today are minuscule cultural differences. But again, I'm rambling here a bit, but I'm trying to hammer home the point that a nation and a country should not be used synonymously. The term should not be used synonymously. But anyway, were we in a class on U.S. foreign policy, this would be one of the themes I would come back to throughout, but we're not, so I'll move on. Anyway, non-state actors is a term that I use a lot in my field. This is a group other than a state that attempts to play a role in the international system. And examples of this would be terrorist groups and international organizations. Al-Qaeda, I just mentioned a couple slides ago, did not control Afghanistan, but it is a terrorist group that existed in Afghanistan and spread beyond, that, not to defend the actions of Al-Qaeda, changed the course of world history, right? That's a non-state actor, right? Al-Qaeda has done more to change 21st century history thus far than North Korea has, right? And North Korea is a state. But anyway, there we go. These are some distinctions to clarify some terms that will come up throughout the lecture. But anyway, let's think about foreign policy goals. Security is pretty much the first and most important goal of U.S. foreign policy, right? And this can cover a lot more ground than maybe you immediately think of. We could talk about ensuring food supplies, infrastructure, energy supplies, by which I mean oil, and the physical security of the population, which needs to be protected from foreign threats, right? That's the goal of security in U.S. foreign policy. Protecting U.S. political institutions can be added to the list of security concerns, right? We could talk about, say, controversies surrounding Russian efforts to influence the 2016 presidential election. I can't remember if it was late 2020 or early 2021, that there was a supposedly Russian hacker that attacked the water supply in Florida. There was another one, I think, in early 2021 that involved hacking the whatever you want to call it, the servers, the mainframe of an energy supply company in the southeast of the United States. So we can talk about political institutions and private institutions that depend on the U.S. government for protection. So security, the notion of security is evolving, um, into this current century. Varies quite differently from security strategies of the past, right? Before there were, I mean, and believe me, this actually existed. The world existed before smartphones and before the stupid internet and all these things. And prior to technological development that we've seen in the back half of the 20th century and beyond, it was pretty easy for the United States to, say, use isolationism as a security strategy. In effect, sticking our collective head in the sand like a big ostrich, right? The desire to avoid involvement in the affairs of other states. And this was the U.S. strategy with caveats until World War I. One of those big caveats would be the Monroe Doctrine, right? You've heard of James Monroe, president in the early 1800s, about 200 years ago, basically said to Europeans in the right immediately after the real decline of the Spanish Empire in the Americas and the independence of Brazil in 1822, James Monroe said, "Hey, Europe, you are going to stay out of the Americas, right? We're going to declare pretty much the Western Hemisphere as the sphere of influence, not spear, sorry, Freudian slip talking about foreign policy, sphere of influence of the United States." So it's not that the United States was involved in Latin America as it's been involved in Afghanistan for the last 20 years, not so directly, but the United States definitely meddled as it wished in the affairs of many Latin American countries from that time to really about till the end of the Cold War. And this will be discussed in the Why We Fight film, which I really hope you like. Appeasement was a strategy then employed in the interwar period after World War I, before World War II. This was an effort to forestall war by giving in to the demands of a hostile power. And by a hostile power, I mean Nazi Germany. Europe, with the blessing of the United States, appeased Hitler's wishes to invade Czechoslovakia. And the rest of what would become the Allied powers hopes that maybe Hitler will just stop there, which Hitler did not. So appeasement was a security strategy that didn't last very long and didn't work very well. After World War II, the United States turned to what we called containment, or the Truman Doctrine, which was a policy designed to curtail political and military expansion of hostile powers, by which we mean really Soviet Russia or the Soviet Union. And the Truman Doctrine, again, was one of containment that, the Cold War will be discussed in the Why We Fight film. It was definitely a time of great insecurity around the world, thanks to the hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union, and then their corresponding and respective allies. But the United States did a lot of pretty crappy things after World War II, like instigating a coup in Greece, and basically oppressing any center to left-leaning sentiments in Italy. And this was all done in the name of containment, right? To prevent the spread of communism, which was identified really as anything that the United States didn't like. We just called it communism and declared it a threat. But it's something that we don't learn a lot about in history class in the United States, in high school or even in college, I imagine. But it's something that if you start to learn a bit more on your own as you grow up in college and beyond, you might start to realize why we see a lot of anti-American sentiment around the world. The two links I have here, the Truman Doctrine, will take you to a short interview with a journalist and author who I quite like named Susie Hansen, where she talks about moving to Turkey and learning while there, or Greece, I forget, or both. I know she was based in Turkey and spent some time in Greece, but learning what the United States government did in the name of defending freedom and covertly in those two countries, which neighbor each other and have a very contentious relationship to begin with. But it took her being in her 30s and becoming a journalist to learn these things. And then after she was interviewed for this piece on PBS NewsHour, she published in The Guardian an article called Unlearning the Myth of American Innocence, which came from a book called Notes from a Foreign Country, both of which I recommend. I'll give you the short version in this hyperlink here. It's only a couple of pages long. If you're at all interested in what I'm talking about, have a look at it. If you spend some time abroad, you'd probably appreciate it. Have a look at it. Have a look at it. I'm not going to keep beating the dead horse, but there you go. Things to consider. Beyond containment, we could talk of deterrence as well. This was more of a direct strategy with the Soviet Union. The goal was to develop and maintain such military strength as to discourage attack from really the only rival that the United States had after World War II until really the start of the 21st century, and that was the Soviet Union, which, by the way, collapsed in 1991. So, if we can't contain threats in peripheral places outside of the Soviet Union, what we will do is build enough strength to deter attack by the Soviet Union. And the Soviets tried to do the same, and that's why really the Cold War was just one big arms race. But anyway, Lowy gives you this picture here. No to convoys, no to war, no death for American boys. You'll notice here the America First Committee. This was a group prior to World War II that basically had Nazi sympathies, and for that reason argued that the United States not get involved in World War II. And they use this nice term, America First, which maybe you've heard before in more recent years, right? I will recommend HBO's The Plot Against America. This was based on a novel by Philip Dick, I believe was the author's name. In the HBO series, while HBO does a lot of good things, this is not the greatest thing I think HBO's done, but it's not bad. My wife, who's from Venezuela, and her knowledge of U.S. history in the broader sense is kind of thin. She got a lot out of it, and I did too as a political scientist. So if you're at all interested in the political climate of the United States in the run-up to World War II, a lot to do with anti-Semitism, a lot to do with anti-communist sentiment, or really just anti any sort of remotely leftist sentiment, I recommend The Plot Against America. Fast forward here, America First in the 21st century, you might recognize the red hat there that this nice, we'll assume she's nice lady, is wearing with a nice sign saying America First, right? So this whole notion of America First certainly did not begin with the Trump administration. So please don't ever, if you thought that, erase it from your memory. But anyway, moving on here, security during the Cold War. The Cold War, to give you a definition here, because I was born when the Cold War was still going on, and when I was little, it was something that I would hear adults talk about often, part of my socialization here. But this was a period between about the late 1940s to about 1990. So the end of World War II to the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which the United States and the Soviet Union were at each other's throats, basically trying to outspend each other and outarm each other. But unlike hot wars, the United States and the Soviet Union never engaged directly in military conflict. We can find a lot of examples where, say, proxy wars were fought, or where, say, the United States went to war in Vietnam and the Soviet Union backed the North Vietnamese, but the Soviet Union and the United States were never directly involved. Hey, remember Afghanistan? The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, and the United States financed the Mujahideen to fight against the Soviet Union for a decade. That Mujahideen then evolved into what would become Al-Qaeda and by extension the Taliban. So, we can't say that necessarily these proxy wars were great ideas, but it did at the very least keep the United States and the Soviet Union from destroying each other. Because if that had happened, we probably wouldn't be here right now. An example of this would be the Cuban Missile Crisis. I won't bore you with great details because you can watch this link. It's a short clip from a 2004 or 5 documentary called The Fog of War, which was an interview with the now deceased former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, where he talks about how in 1962 the United States government discovered missiles, nuclear-capable missiles in Cuba that had been clandestinely delivered by the Soviet Union. And the Kennedy administration basically said, pull the missiles out to the Soviet Union, pull the missiles out, or we're going to nuke Cuba. And surprise, surprise, it did not come to that, but it was, in McNamara's words, perhaps one of the most dangerous moments in U.S. history. So have a quick watch of that, and then come back and watch the follow-up with Castro in 1992. The 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union marked the end of the Cold War and, in effect, a victory for containment. And it also allowed for greater dialogue between the belligerents in the Cold War. And in the second clip here, McNamara will tell us about his meeting with Fidel Castro in 1992, in which Castro basically told Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, to go ahead and do it, go to war. Pretty scary stuff. But, McNamara and the Kennedy administration managed to escape unscathed from the Cuban Missile Crisis. But fast forwarding quite a bit to the 21st century, a real topic of debate, some 20 years ago now, as the United States was getting itself into Afghanistan, we made this distinction between preemptive and preventive war. The distinction is very subtle, but preemptive war is launched in anticipation of an immediate aggression by another party. It's like acting in self-defense. This person's pulled a gun on me, I'm going to shoot them first. Preventive war is launched to destroy the potential threat when an attack by that party is not imminent or known to be planned. Right, so that's like saying this person perhaps might go buy a gun in the future and maybe might consider shooting me. So maybe I'll just shoot this person first, right? Nip it in the bud. That would be preventive war, and that's illegal under international law. Preemptive war is legal under international law, and the Bush Doctrine, formulated after September 11th, argued that the United States should take preemptive action against threats to its national security, by which it really meant preventive action. This was the case made to invade Iraq in 2003, saying that, well, it's clear that Iraq is going to attack the United States while the U.S. government was riding the wave of muddied water between Afghanistan and Iraq. So voters widely thought that Iraq had something to do with September 11th, so that this would have been retribution as well. But really, history has shown us that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction, as was claimed. Iraq was not involved in September 11th, as was insinuated more than once. So really, the invasion of Iraq could be chalked up as a preventive war, and it was never sanctioned by international law. But anyway, this is the crux of the Why We Fight documentary. So keep this in mind while you watch that film. Fast forward a bit to 2015. We can look at how diplomacy was maybe used as a tool for security, or a security strategy, in the signing of the infamous Iran nuclear deal between the United States, Iran, and a few other players, Russia, China, the EU, and Germany independently of the EU. But this was an agreement made to reduce sanctions on the Iranian regime in exchange for Iran to not build nuclear weapons. And this was really derided. This was a good example of politicized foreign policy, right? Politics did not end at the country's shores there. Republicans hated the Iran deal when the Obama administration signed it in 2015. The Trump administration pulled out of it once Trump took office in 2017. And by the time Biden entered office in 2021, there has been an attempt to revive the deal because Iran is really hurting under the sanctions. And nobody wants Iran to build nuclear weapons. So moving on here, let's talk about economic prosperity. I think we've talked about security as much as we need to. A second foreign policy goal is promoting economic prosperity. There's several different ways that the United States uses international diplomacy to do this. We could talk about the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, which is basically dominated by the United States, and under which agreements can be made to offer really low tariff rates. Tariffs, talked about them in weeks prior, are in effect taxes charged on imports into a country. So most favored nation status is in effect lowering trade barriers to almost allow for free trade between partners. This used to be, prior to the Trump administration, for most of the back half of the 20th century, one of the US's major international multilateral mechanisms to try to try to cultivate economic growth at home while getting trade partners to do what the United States wanted them to do. We can talk about the North American Free Trade Agreement, called NAFTA. This was an agreement that was negotiated under George H.W. Bush's administration, signed under the Clinton administration, was a trilateral agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada to, in effect, lower or eliminate tariffs, allow for free trade and movement of goods and capital, not of people, of course. This was renegotiated by the Trump administration in 2018 as the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which I try to make sound like YMCA, but I'm tone deaf and it sucks. So I apologize. But anyway, so that's a regional mechanism that seeks economic prosperity. We can also talk about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was negotiated, began under the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, George W. Bush, and then continued under 8 years of the Obama administration, to the point that countries started signing it. And then the Trump administration pulled out of all the negotiations. But the TPP was meant to bring together a bunch of trading partners whose borders reached the Pacific Ocean and excluded China. It was really viewed by the Chinese government as an international anti-China trading partnership. But countries as far away as Australia and Chile and Mexico and Japan were on board. But the president at the time decided to pull out. Shifting gears yet again, humanitarian policies. This is another goal of U.S. foreign policy. We could talk about environmental protection, human rights, peacekeeping efforts aimed at improving the lives of individuals in other countries. Sounds great, and presidents love to talk about it, but the fact of the matter is humanitarian concerns frequently take a back seat to security and economic interests in U.S. foreign policy. This is a photo from the Lowy text in a discussion of the U.S. Offering to send money to support refugees from the civil war in Syria that's been going on for well over a decade now. The United States preferred to throw money at that problem as more Syrians were, by 2015 and beyond, flooding into Europe. What the United States, really under the Obama administration, then reduced further under the Trump administration, did was deny entry into the United States as refugees, people from the conflict in Syria. So humanitarian aid sounds nice, but it's really not a priority, I would say, for U.S. foreign policy. Another thing that I think the case can be made is not much of a concern for U.S. foreign policy is the environment and climate change. Katznelson, does not surprise me that Katznelson gives some discussion to this topic. This photo comes from page 374 of the Katznelson text. What does kind of surprise me is how short the discussion is. It's like 3 paragraphs in the Katznelson text on climate change, global warming, and the ecological crisis as a humanitarian concern. But anyway, there it is. Hyperlink there will take you to a surprise last week tonight with John Oliver clip about environment and foreign policy. So discussion question here. This one's pretty easy. Which do you believe best motivates U.S. foreign policy objectives? Pretty safe to say that security concerns. Don't need to spend a lot of time on that. Sorry for clicking through so fast. But security, and then economics, and then humanitarian concerns, really without a doubt. Let's think about how foreign policy is made. The president is, of course, the head of state and commander-in-chief, so that gives the president a lot of power in U.S. foreign policy making. Right, the president has control over the diplomatic and military institutions of the country, both of which fall under the executive bureaucracy, which we've talked about. And really, presidential authority over foreign policy has grown substantially in the post-World War II era, whether that is back to the Truman Doctrine and the White House making secret unilateral decisions that affected U.S. foreign policy in the long term, talk about involvement in the Vietnam War. We could talk about how President Bush was, in effect, the leader of the world on September 11th and had a great amount of freedom to make foreign policy decisions in the immediate aftermath. And then we could flash forward again to the impeachment of 2020 as an indicator of that, right? You had then President Trump in that famous phone call to the Ukrainian president asking for political favors to help him electorally at home. That was to be a no-no. Remember that quote from the Vandenberg guy, politics ends at the country's shores? Well, I think if anything, 2020 showed us that the president has even more free reign over foreign policy than we thought, because it made pretty clear that Congress was not going to sanction the president for asking for political favors from a foreign leader. So I think it's safe to say that presidential authority over foreign policy is pretty well established. Flipping the coin and changing parties, the assassination of bin Laden in May of 2011, pretty much the same thing, right? The Obama administration handled this entirely unilaterally. I mean, there was only a select handful of people who even knew about the plan to assassinate bin Laden, or who even knew where he was, in Pakistan, by the way. And it was done completely in secret, right? Not even the Pakistani government or military knew about the attack until it happened. And there it was. We could make a case that bin Laden probably should have known he had his days numbered by September 11th, 2001. But the case could also be made that the execution of bin Laden, or the execution of the raid that executed bin Laden, was done entirely by the White House, right? With no oversight by Congress before, or as to my knowledge, after the fact, right? So anyway, the president, long and the short of it, is pretty much the decider in U.S. foreign policy. The bureaucracy is still pretty important, and there are numerous agencies that implement U.S. foreign policy, whether that's the State Department, Department of Defense, Central Intelligence Agency. The list can go on and on and on. The problem is these agencies do not always agree or have the same interests, right? They don't always agree with each other or have the same interests. The example, and a good example of this would be that there are 17 spy agencies in the United States. I cannot list them all, but you can add, the Department of Homeland Security, I'm sure, has one. The FBI is a spy agency, the NSA, the CIA, the Department of Defense has a spy agency, and so on and so forth. And one of the consequences, or in the aftermath of September 11th, and the government investigation into what happened, was that the CIA and the FBI were not communicating freely with each other to share information. They're in effect involved in a turf war with each other, not wanting to do anything to facilitate the other agency gaining the limelight. So to remedy this, after September 11th, the Department of Homeland Security, or the DHS, and the Director of National Intelligence were created, both of which were meant to increase coordination among U.S. Bureaucratic institutions to better protect U.S. citizens, right? Moving on here, we can talk about Congress. Congress is important in foreign policymakers because Congress is the only institution with the constitutional power to declare war. Presidents don't declare war. Congress does. However, this has not happened since World War II. Ever since, what happens is that Congress votes to authorize the president to use force. So Congress effectively abdicates its power. The Senate ratifies treaties and confirms presidential appointments to say, run to be the U.S. representative to the UN, to be the Secretary of State, so on and so forth. A way around treaty ratification is the use of executive agreements, which I've talked about in weeks prior. So I won't beat the dead horse entirely here, but basically the difference between a treaty and an executive agreement, both of which the U.S. president signs, is whether or not the president wants to call it a treaty or an executive agreement. Presidents only call them treaties when presidents are pretty sure that they will be ratified by the Senate. And really from the days of Washington to today, it's pushing 90% of international agreements that the United States signs are executive agreements and not treaties. So, you know, hooray for the Constitution there. Congress also has what we call the power of the purse. Congress can authorize or deny funding for different things that, say, a president might want to do internationally. Congress, we know, has the power to regulate commerce with foreign countries. That's the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Congress has the power to investigate and exercise oversight over presidential decisions in foreign policy. And an example of that would be, say, when Hillary Clinton was called to testify by the Republican-controlled House in the primary season of 2016, basically to make her look bad, because she had been the Secretary of State when the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, Libya, was attacked on September 11th of 2012. I'm not saying that that wasn't necessary, but to investigate. But the timing was a bit conspicuous. We could talk about the War Powers Act of 1973. Congress passed a law in the aftermath of Vietnam to really limit the scope and the reach of U.S. presidents and what they could do without congressional approval. And this came up again, I say influential today, and there's a hyperlink, because it was on the radar again by 2018. One of the first, I think the first veto or overriding a veto of President Trump's done by Congress was to, in effect, impose Congress's will on U.S. support or the U.S.'s role in the civil war in Yemen, which has been going on for a number of years and is, in effect, a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The U.S., of course, is a Saudi Arabian ally and an enemy of Iran. So the U.S. has been involved with that, but Congress in 2018 stepped in to the Oval Office and metaphorically tapped Trump on the shoulder and said, you're going to have to back off of the support for Saudi Arabia because that's what we want. So Congress does occasionally show some spine. So to say the War Powers Act of 1973 is a dead letter is incorrect, but Congress really does take a backseat to the president. Further in the backseat, we can talk of interest groups. Often economic interest groups or single issue groups are most effective. We can talk about arms makers as an economic interest group in and of themselves. And the term we use here is the military industrial complex, which will be discussed at great length in the film Why We Fight. So pay attention to that, use the term in your paper, and think about the film in the context of Katznelson's ongoing thesis throughout his book on this distinction or even tension between democracy and capitalism. It's right at the end of the film Why We Fight that one of the talking heads says something to this effect, that if we view democracy and capitalism as in any sort of competition, capitalism is clearly winning, is what this guy thinks. And that's what I think Katznelson seems to think too. But have a watch of the film, as most of you need to do, and see what you think. But we talk about other interest groups, say ethnic lobbying, the Israeli lobby, Irish lobby, the Armenian lobby. These are examples of other groups that seek to shape foreign policy. They can't dictate, they can't decide anything, but they can definitely inform. And that's why, for example, I'll mention this later, the United States still sends about $3 billion a year to Israel in military aid. I don't think that would happen without an effective pro-Israeli lobby in the United States. The Armenian lobby, Armenia is a very small country that borders Turkey in Southwest Asia, but until recently, it had not been very successful in getting the United States to recognize the Armenian genocide perpetrated by the Ottoman Empire, or what would become Turkey, at the end of World War I. But the Armenian lobby in 2021 was successful in getting the U.S. government to recognize the Armenian genocide. So these are not small examples. You might not know where Armenia is on a map, but the Armenian lobby in the United States is pretty influential. We talk about human rights groups such as Amnesty International, the Christian Coalition, the Doctors Without Borders, you name it. There's a laundry list of of human rights groups that also seek to influence foreign policy, and they aren't nearly as successful as others. Here we have a photo from a previous edition of the Lowy text of Hillary Clinton talking at the American-Israeli Political Action Committee conference in 2016, I believe. Pretty much every presidential candidate pays lip service to AIPAC because it's a political action committee that no one wants to be on the wrong side of. Other interest groups, and going back to the military-industrial complex, we can talk about military contractors, which is discussed. The use of contractors is discussed in the Lowy text. I just read through it again, and I don't have the page in front of me. 465 in the 16th edition of the text. But the problem with military contractors, and I believe I discussed this in a previous set of slides, is that it's a lot harder to exert governmental oversight and ensure the rule of law when you're dealing with private military contractors abroad, right? You can't apply the U.S. military code. You can't easily apply U.S. criminal code when they do nasty things like murder and rape people. So anyway, but read through that discussion in the Lowy text. The in brief deal, I'll leave this here. We've covered the bases. I guess I haven't really talked about the media as a shaper of foreign policy, but think about it in the context of priming and framing and agenda setting and all these things we've talked about. The media, I think, was definitely on board for the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, or at least as I recall following the media. I was living in Spain at the time. But anyway, quiz question. Which one of the following branches of the U.S. government is explicitly given the power to declare war? You should know this. It is the Congress, right? I said it, but I said it very quickly. And again, since World War II, Congress has never declared war. Congress authorizes the president to use force, rightly or wrongly. It's just how things have evolved. Such decisions will also be criticized in the Why We Fight film. Let's think about crisis in foreign policy. Times of crisis tend to concentrate power in the hands of the president. This happens with any type of crisis, domestic or foreign. But as you can imagine, World War II was kind of a crisis. The Cold War was a constant crisis. We seem to have some period of peace immediately after the Cold War, but that only lasted for about 10 years before September 11th. So this helps us to understand how and why every president since Eisenhower has further consolidated power in the office of the president. And every president of every party will continue to do so until we decide to stop. But in general, presidents wield far more power over foreign policy than domestic policy. And in practice, far more power over foreign policy than Congress, crisis or not, right? And I think I've made that clear, so I'm not going to reiterate that point now. Instruments of modern U.S. foreign policy, we can obviously talk about diplomacy, and I've touched on diplomacy already, say, regarding the Iranian deal. But this is representation of a government to other governments. The Department of State is the federal government's chief diplomatic arm. It's led by the Secretary of State, but whose boss is the president. So this is yet another extension of the executive bureaucracy. The Foreign Service Act was created in 1946 to create a fully professional diplomatic corps. So before then, the Department of State was a much smaller outfit before 1946 than it was after, and it's continued to grow since. But I think that would be an indicator of the shift from isolationism to international engagement, right? That's been inevitable for a lot of different reasons. Quick mention of the United Nations. I'm sure you've heard of the UN at some point or another, but this is an organization of countries founded in 1945 that was meant to be a channel for negotiation and a means of settling disputes peaceably. It consists of the General Assembly, which is made up of made up of every member state, and the Security Council. The UN Security Council has 15 members, 5 of which are permanent. And these would be the 5 countries that were victorious, the allied powers who were victorious in World War II, the United States, Russia, France, China, and the UK. These 5 countries exercise the greatest degree of influence. Nothing can be decided in the Security Council without these 5 countries being in agreement. They, in effect, all have veto power over decisions made by the Security Council. And that's important because the Security Council is the only body that makes binding decisions in the EU. The General Assembly can vote, 186 to 3 on something, and that's not law. It's not international law. It's merely advisory. The Security Council is the organ or the institution that makes effective decisions. And again, note I said the Allied powers that were victorious in World War II. We forget that the Soviet Union fought with the United States. China fought with the United States and France and the UK in World War II. Right? 27 million Russians died in World War II beating the Nazis. And if they hadn't, I bet the United States and France and UK wouldn't have been victorious on the Western Front as they were. But as a reward for World War II, these 5 countries got together and gave themselves veto power over the UN Security Council and its decisions. But now that Russia and China have, they're not really allies, but they are to the extent that they share mutual enemies, or frenemies at least, in the United States. So it really makes it difficult to make decisions about, say, the civil war in Syria, which Russia backs the regime, the United States does not. Russia is an ally of Iran, the United States is not. Russia backs Venezuela, the United States does not. So it makes it really difficult for the Security Council to make decisions today because its model is based on who won World War II, right? So, but it's going to take all 5 of these countries to agree to make any change. So good luck with that. Moving on here, we talk about economic aid and sanctions. Each year, the United States provides nearly $30 billion in economic assistance to other countries. About 10% of that goes to Israel. Israel and Egypt are the largest recipients of aid from the United States. And this despite the fact that the average income in Israel is $47,000, right? I mean, it's more than South Korea. It rivals a lot of rural parts of the United States. But nonetheless, for security reasons, the United States gives Israel more money than any other country on the face of the earth. And number 2 is Egypt, and Egypt clocks in with a per capita income of nearly $4,000. This is recent data from the International Monetary Fund. But in effect, this aid is the carrot of U.S. foreign policy, and economic sanctions are the stick, right? So sanctions are, say, economic embargoes on world leaders and their immediate aids and assistance and such. That disallow them to, say, put their money in certain places, particularly in the United States, which is an important and pretty attractive safe haven for people's money. But anyway, here you see a timeline of aid and military assistance from 1980 to 2018. This is pages 474 and 475 of Lowy. And you can see that the trend has definitely been to go up, but as the economy has grown, it's varied in the blue line here, which is a percent of GDP, but it's never been below or never been above about a fifth of the United States economy. Talk about collective security here, and I promise I'm about done. Talking about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is NATO. You've hopefully heard of NATO at some point. This is a treaty organization made up of the United States, Canada, and most of the other Western countries that were involved in World War II and beyond after 1949 to counter the perceived threat from the Soviet Union. Since the 1990s, NATO has played a central role in a number of conflicts around the world. It's also expanded pretty greatly to include a lot of former Soviet states, which has definitely irked modern-day Russia. Russia does not like having NATO members on its border, and it now has a few of them. But anyway, United States' role in world politics more broadly. One of the reasons I still use the Katznelson book, even though it was published in 2014, is that it keeps things fresh in our heads, like the fact that the United States still has a naval base in Cuba at Guantanamo Bay, and within that naval base held hundreds, in the early 2000s, he's held hundreds of, in effect, prisoners of war who were not called that, because if they were called that, they'd have rights under international law, but they were called enemy combatants according to U.S. law and held indefinitely in Guantanamo. As of 2021, I believe there were still some 70 people held at Guantanamo who, for various different reasons, can't be tried and can't be sent home. So it's a pretty complicated, I don't know what I would want to call it, pretty complicated reality of U.S. foreign policy, consequence of perhaps not the best decision making back in the immediate aftermath of 2001, September 11th. Here's another photos from a previous edition of Lowy, but I leave it in here just to remind us that while Obama was viewed by some in Europe, Latin America as, oh, hey, evidence that the United States is progressing socially throughout the Muslim world, Obama really was not liked at all. And surprise, surprise, it's because U.S. foreign policy really didn't change much from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. There's really no debate there. The United States kept Guantanamo Bay open throughout the 8 years of the Obama administration. The United States was present in Afghanistan, in Iraq, droning the crap out of people throughout the region under the Obama administration. So, go figure. So the United States, regardless of who's in the White House, depending on where you look around the globe, you're going to find somebody not too happy with U.S. foreign policy. This has a lot to do with the use of military force, which we traditionally have seen as a tool of last resort, and it's particularly risky. The 16th edition of the Lowy text ends with a discussion of public opinion and casualties in U.S. foreign policy, which I'd encourage you to have a look at. I'm not going to talk about that in my last couple of slides, but it provides some more context for this here. But obviously, the use of military force is never, the outcomes are never certain. And this is despite how easy outcomes are presented to the public, right? I mean, in the Why We Fight film, you'll see that Dick Cheney, the former vice president, claimed that the United States would be visited as greeted as liberators. The United States would be out of Iraq in 18 months, and that didn't happen. And I think that's one of the reasons why I wanted to open with a quick mention of Afghanistan, because the U.S. presence there has been ongoing for a couple of decades, and I don't think in October of 2001, when the United States went in, that anybody thought that the United States would still have the presence that it had 20 years later. But each action brings with it, obviously, the threat of casualties and loss of life, and that's been a sad reality of U.S. foreign policy. Lastly, as we wrap up here, give you an idea, the United States spends 36%, or at least in 2018, spent 36% of all the money spent around the world on military expenditures. So, that the United States is perhaps much faster to use military force might be an indicator of the fact that it spends so much money on its military. Maybe there's a cause and effect there. But number two, global spender is China at 14%. So, clocking in at about under half of what the United States spends. And then all the other countries on this list are allies of the United States. Right? Allies of the United States. The United States is not going to go to war with Germany or go to war with Japan. But nonetheless, we keep spending money on the military. So, question might be why? And this gets to the crux of what I want you to think about when you watch Why We Fight. Shifting gears again, as I wrap up, I got just a few slides left, and there's not a lot to say about them. But this is from the 15th edition of the Lowy textbook here. You see the U.S. budget. Remember, mandatory spending is what the government has to spend on things like Social Security because it's been decided by law that the government will spend this money. Discretionary spending is what the Congress has discretion to decide on how to spend. And nearly half of that goes to defense spending. So it might, I don't know, you might agree with that. You might think the United States needs to spend more. I don't know. That's up to each individual voter to opine. Interest obviously is there because the United States government has to borrow lots and lots of money. But here you see defense spending estimated trends out to 2020. Republican. The thinking is Republican presidents spend more on the military, but you see after 2008, when Obama was elected, the numbers went up, started to decline before 2016, and didn't go up much further under the Trump administration. But that spending, I don't think, is very sustainable, right?
Remember how we discussed last time around the rising costs of Social Security, um, and the realities of healthcare expenditures and an aging population. At some point, the United States is going to have to figure out how to more effectively spend money on its defense, maybe by reducing defense spending, but using that money more wisely, because we're going to have to devote more money to other places if we want to keep the country afloat. But there again, I'll put in another plug for why we fight. Uh, One of the interviewees makes the point that Al Qaeda likely spent about $500,000 on September 11th on the attack, and the United States spends billions upon billions of dollars a year on its military. So if you could buy security, the United States has yet to achieve that goal, right? So I'm not saying defund the military, but what I'm saying is maybe think about how to spend money a little more wisely. But ultimately, as I'm out of slides here, I hope that you got something out of this class, and I got you thinking maybe about how we could govern ourselves a bit more wisely, or how maybe you could how you maybe shouldn't miss elections, things of that nature. But anyway, please be in touch. Please let me know if you have any questions about why we fight, want to talk about a thesis statement, or let me see a paper. I'm happy to help. Okay. Good luck to you. Bye bye.